Rome, 1501. The city was a stage where every stone, every shadow, whispered of power and betrayal. That night, the Vatican's power pulsed just beyond the banquet hall of Cardinal Orsini's palazzo, where the air hung heavy with incense and roasting meats. Candlelight flickered across gilded walls, making the saints in their frescoes seem to watch, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. The hall was alive with the chatter of noblemen and bishops, their jeweled fingers wrapped around golden goblets, their laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. Minstrels plucked at lutes in the corner, their notes weaving through the murmur of political schemes disguised as polite conversation. Rome was at peace, at least on the surface, but beneath the velvet and lace, every guest here knew they were part of a dangerous game. At the center of the long banquet table sat a young woman in a gown of molten gold silk. Her hair, pale as wheat in sunlight, fell loose over her shoulders, and a string of pearls rested against her throat. She was neither queen nor princess, yet the attention of the entire room seemed to orbit around her. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of the Pope, sister to the feared Cesare Borgia, and the subject of more rumors than anyone dared count. To some, she was a saintly beauty wronged by the world. To others, she was the Vatican's deadliest weapon, the velvet glove hiding a hand that held poison. And tonight, her presence at this banquet had tongues wagging because one of the men at this table had dared oppose the Borgias. Midway through the feast, a servant approached with a tray of crystal decanters, each filled with dark, fragrant wine from the Alban Hills. He moved slowly, deliberately, pouring for each guest. When he reached Lucrezia, he bowed, his eyes flickering nervously to her face. She smiled, faint and unreadable, and her long, pale fingers brushed the stem of her goblet. It was then that those closest to the head of the table noticed the tension ripple through the air. Cardinal Orsini leaned toward his guest of honor, a tall man in a crimson doublet, a known adversary of the Pope's latest decree. The man laughed at something, whispered to him, then lifted his cup in a mock toast toward Lucrezia before draining it in one long swallow. Moments later, his laughter turned into a strangled gasp. His goblet slipped from his hand, crashing to the marble floor as he clawed at his throat. The hall erupted in chaos. Servants rushed forward, guests leapt from their seats, and the minstrel's music dissolved into a discordant tangle of abandoned notes. The man's face was turning a shade of purple-blue, his lips trembling as he tried to draw breath. Around him, voices shouted for water, for a physician, for the mercy of God. And there, just beyond the knot of panicked courtiers, Lucrezia remained seated. Her gaze was fixed on the dying man, her expression calm, too calm for some. A wisp of hair fell across her cheek as she tilted her head slightly, like an artist studying a painting. "Poison," someone hissed. The words slithered through the room like smoke. One of the servants, trembling, pale, pointed with a shaking hand. "I saw her," he cried, her hand over his cup just before he drank. Dozens of eyes turned to her, the sudden weight of suspicion heavy enough to crush. Yet Lucrezia did not flinch. The guards closed in, their chainmail whispering against velvet curtains. One stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Stand, my lady." She rose gracefully, as though she were merely preparing to dance. Her gown shimmered in the candlelight, and when she extended her hands for inspection, her voice was steady. "Search me." They did carefully, as though afraid to touch her too long. No vial, no pouch, no trace of any deadly powder was found. Her goblet was clean, her plate untouched. The dying man gave a final, rattling breath before collapsing into the arms of those trying to help him. Silence fell like a shroud over the hall. Lucrezia's eyes, impossibly clear, swept the room, pausing on the servant who had spoken against her. She smiled a slow, chilling curve of the lips before turning to leave. Not a word of defense, not a plea, not a tear. In her wake, the whispers rose again, frantic and fearful. Was it the fabled cantarella, the Borgia poison said to kill without trace? Or was it simply bad fortune, twisted by the superstition that clung to her name? Outside, The night air of Rome was cool and heavy with the scent of the Tiber. The palazzo's heavy doors shut behind her, sealing in the scent of wine and death. Somewhere in the city, a church bell tolled a sound that in Rome could mean either salvation or damnation. And behind those doors, the story that would haunt her life took another turn. For while the man lay dead and no evidence was found, one thing was certain. Lucrezia Borgia had been the last person near his cup. The Vatican would deny it. Her allies would swear her innocence, but the seed had been planted. And seeds, in the dangerous soil of Renaissance Rome, had a way of blooming into something far deadlier than anyone could imagine. Some said she was the poisoner. Others swore she was just a pawn. But that night, in the city where sin wore silk and piety wore a mask, a legend tightened its grip, one that would stain her name for centuries to come. The next morning, before the city had even woken fully, the servant who accused her was found floating face down in the Tiber. No one ever discovered who put him there. To understand the shadow that followed Lucrezia Borgia through her life, we must step back 21 years from that fateful night. The year was 1480, and Rome was not the marble and gold sanctuary imagined by pilgrims. It was a city simmering with vice and ambition, where the lines between the sacred and the profane blurred beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Lucrezia was born in Subiaco, a hill town outside Rome, to Venozza dei Catanei, a Roman woman of both beauty and shrewdness, and a man who, at the time, was not yet pope, but already one of the Vatican's most powerful cardinals, Rodrigo Borgia. He was a Spaniard in an Italian court, a master of charm and manipulation, who had climbed the ecclesiastical ladder not through piety, but through cunning, alliances, and an unshakable will to power. From her earliest days, Lucrezia's life was steeped in the contradictions of her family. She was the daughter of a man sworn to celibacy, yet openly acknowledged as his child. Her brothers Giovanni, Cesare, and Joffre were born of the same union, each marked for a role in Rodrigo's grand design. For Rodrigo, children were not burdens, they were weapons in the war for dominance over Italy. When she was only 3 years old, Lucrezia was brought to Rome and placed in the care of Adriana de Mila, a cousin of her father and a trusted guardian. Her childhood unfolded in the Vatican's orbit, where corridors echoed with Latin prayers by day and hushed conspiracies by night. She was given an education far beyond what most women of her time received. Latin, Greek, poetry, music, and the intricate dance of courtly etiquette. But this was no act of benevolence. Every lesson was an investment. Rodrigo was not raising a daughter. He was grooming a political instrument. By the time she turned 11, her father had been elected Pope Alexander VI, an event that sent shockwaves through Christendom. His coronation was a festival of extravagance. Processions of silk-clad cardinals, fountains flowing with wine, and banquets that seemed to defy the very vows of austerity the Church claimed to uphold. Yet behind the jubilation lurked murmurs of outrage. The Borgias were seen by many as the embodiment of corruption, a family that had bought the papacy with bribes, promises, and the Pope's own shameless indulgences. Lucrezia's position changed overnight. She was now the Pope's daughter, a title both intoxicating and perilous. It meant she would live in rooms draped in velvet, dine from gold, and wear jewels imported from the Orient. But it also meant her life was no longer her own. She was a bargaining chip, a thread to be woven into alliances with the most powerful families in Italy, and, if necessary, cut without hesitation. Still, in those early years, Lucrezia was known for a gentleness that disarmed many. Visitors to the papal court remarked on her beauty. Pale skin that seemed to hold the light green, gold eyes that could look innocent or knowing depending on the angle, and hair the colour of ripe wheat. But beauty in Renaissance Italy was never just admired. It was measured, valued, and used, and Pope Alexander understood that better than anyone. The papal court itself was a paradox, a theatre where bishops prayed at dawn and gambled by night, where brothels flourished just beyond the basilica's shadow, and where the Pope's children were fixtures at every feast. For all its grandeur, the Vatican was a nest of knives, each cardinal sharpening his blade for the next political strike. In this world, trust was rarer than virtue. Lucrezia grew into it like a flower among thorns. She learned to smile when she wanted to spit, to laugh when she wanted to weep, and to speak in a way that revealed nothing and suggested everything. Even as a girl, she moved through the court with a grace that made allies underestimate her and enemies second-guess their plans. Her closest bond was with her brother Cesare, a man whose ambition was matched only by his capacity for violence. Cesare was everything a prince of the church was not supposed to be. Bold, ruthless, and unashamedly dangerous. He was the blade to their father's mind, the one who enforced the Borgia will with steel and blood. Where others saw a sister, Cesare saw a confidant, someone who could be trusted, if only because she shared his blood and his enemies. By her mid-teens, Lucrezia had become a quiet but constant figure in the political machinations of the papacy. She attended audiences with ambassadors, memorized the faces and weaknesses of visiting dukes, and learned when to listen and when to speak. The world believed she was an ornament of the court. In truth, she was being trained to become its most delicate weapon. But a weapon is only as useful as the hand that wields it. And in the Borgia family, hands rarely trembled. When the time came to forge alliances, Pope Alexander would use his daughter as he might use an army or a chest of gold, deliberately, strategically, and without hesitation. Already, whispers about the Borgias' excesses were spilling from Rome into the courts of Florence, Naples, and Milan. Tales of lavish orgies in the apostolic palace, of bishops who entered meetings with full purses and left with empty ones, and of sudden, inexplicable deaths at banquets. In nearly all of these rumors, the name Lucrezia surfaced sometimes as a silent witness, sometimes as a shadowy accomplice. She was still barely a woman, but in the eyes of Italy, she was already dangerous. And yet, the most perilous part of her life was only beginning. Because soon, the Pope would seek to bind the Borgias to one of the most powerful families in the north. The alliance would come not through treaties or armies, but through Lucrezia's own hand in marriage, a hand that, once given, could just as easily become a chain. The chain, however, would prove more fragile than the Pope could have imagined, and when it broke, it would unleash a scandal that would turn Lucrezia's name into a curse whispered across Europe. The first time Lucrezia Borgia was married, she was barely out of girlhood. Rome's winter of 1493 was damp and heavy. The cobblestones slick under the hooves of the cavalcade that carried Giovanni Sforza into the city. He was Lord of Pesaro, a man of respectable lineage but limited power, and he came not for love, but for politics. For Pope Alexander VI, this was a calculated move. The Sforzas of Milan were influential, and binding them to the Borgias promised stability in the north. A daughter was a convenient bridge, more pliable than armies, less costly than bribes. Lucrezia was 17, graceful in the way a candle flame is graceful, bending but never breaking. She wore a gown of white damask on the day of her wedding, her hair braided with pearls, her smile the kind courtiers couldn't quite read. The marriage began as most political unions did, with ceremony, gifts, and the thin veneer of civility. Sforza was cordial, even indulgent at first, but the atmosphere of the Vatican was a foreign, treacherous landscape for him. He was a minor lord surrounded by wolves. The Pope and Cesare treated him as an asset, not as a family member. Soon it became clear that Sforza's worth to the Borgias was conditional tied to the shifting alliances of Italy's warring states. By 1497, those alliances shifted. Milan's position weakened, and the Pope saw no further use for the bond. Divorce was unthinkable in Catholic Europe, but annulment that could be arranged. The pretext was humiliating. Giovanni Sforza, they claimed, was impotent. A man unable to perform his marital duties was no husband at all in the Church's eyes. The accusation cut deep, and Sforza's response was a blade in return. In a move both desperate and devastating, he countered with a public claim that shocked every court in Italy. Lucrezia, he said, was not only her father's pawn, she was his mistress, and not just his. Sforza accused her of sharing a bed with her brother Cesare as well. The charge of incest was the ultimate scandal. It struck at the moral authority of the papacy itself. turning whispers into open condemnation. Pamphlets circulated in Florence, mocking the Pope as the father in every sense. Political cartoons depicted Lucrezia in grotesque tableaux, draped over her brother's lap, or holding a chalice of poison. The fact that such images were tolerated spoke volumes about how much hatred the Borgias had inspired. For Lucrezia, it was an assault on her very identity. Whether the accusations were true or not, they became the lens through which the world saw her. Ambassadors' letters from the time are filled with venomed descriptions of her as unchaste, calculating, a siren in the Pope's household. No proof was ever produced, but proof mattered little in Renaissance politics. A reputation once tainted was almost impossible to cleanse. While the scandal raged, Lucrezia vanished from public view. Officially, she retired to a convent in San Sisto for prayer and reflection. In reality, it was a form of political quarantine. Behind the convent walls, she awaited her father's next move. Shielded from the public eye, but not from the Vatican's constant plotting. Some accounts claim she gave birth during this period to a mysterious child, the so-called infans Romanus, a baby whose parentage was fiercely debated. Was it her father's, her brother's, or the son of a secret lover? The papal court offered conflicting declarations, feeding the fire of speculation. When the annulment was finalized, Giovanni Sforza returned to Pesaro in disgrace, nursing a wound that would never heal. Lucrezia emerged from the shadows, her name blackened but her value to the Pope undiminished. In the eyes of Alexander VI, she had served her purpose. The Sforza alliance had failed, but there would be others. Her second marriage was arranged almost immediately, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, a young, handsome noble from Naples, whose kingdom was locked in a fragile dance of peace with Rome. It was a match of convenience, but for once there seemed to be affection between them. Alfonso was charming, gallant, and genuinely enamored with his bride. For a time, it appeared that Lucrezia had stepped into a role she might actually desire. That of a wife. Perhaps even a partner. But the Borgias' world was not built for happy endings. Naples soon became a liability. The French advanced in the north, and Cesare shifted his allegiance away from Aragon toward France. Dragging the papacy with him, Alfonso, suddenly, was not a brother-in-law to be cherished, but an obstacle to be removed. The lesson was as brutal as it was clear. In the Vatican's games, affection was a luxury, and luxuries were the first to die. It would not be long before Alfonso's fate proved just how far the Borgias were willing to go to keep their grip on power. It was a warm July evening in 1500 when the blow fell quite literally. Alfonso of Aragon, now Duke of Bisceglie and Lucrezia's second husband, had taken to wandering the gardens of the Vatican to escape the suffocating air of politics. He was young, only in his early 20s, with the kind of open, sunlit face that seemed out of place in Rome's shadowed corridors. That night, he strolled along the steps leading to St. Peter's Basilica, unaware that his death had already been decided. They came at him fast figures in the gloom, steel flashing. A blade plunged into his side, the force sending him sprawling across the marble steps. He shouted for help, his voice echoing against the stone, but the Vatican guards were strangely slow to arrive. By the time they reached him, his blood was pooling in the cracks of the steps, staining the white marble. Miraculously, Alfonso survived. Physicians worked through the night, binding his wounds, whispering prayers as Lucrezia sat beside him. She was frantic, her hands trembling as she pressed cloths against the bleeding. To anyone watching, she seemed a devoted wife, desperate to save her husband, and perhaps she was. But in Rome, survival was a temporary state. Word of the attack spread quickly, and with it came speculation. Alfonso was from Naples, an ally the Pope no longer needed. Cesare Borgia had aligned himself with the French, and Naples was in the way. To many, the attempted assassination looked less like a failed murder and more like unfinished business. Days passed. Alfonso began to recover, his colour returning, his wounds knitting slowly under the care of physicians and Lucrezia's constant vigil. But Cesare was not a man who left loose ends. One night, under the pretext of visiting his brother-in-law to offer comfort, Cesare entered Alfonso's chambers with a handful of guards. Moments later, muffled sounds, a struggle, a gasp, the thud of movement came from behind the door. When it opened again, Alfonso lay motionless. The official report said his injuries had worsened, that fever had claimed him. Those who had been near the room swore otherwise. They whispered of a silk cord, of hands tightening around his throat until the life was gone from him. Cesare had finished what the assassins began. For Lucrezia, the loss was devastating, or at least, it appeared so. She dressed in deep mourning, her eyes red from weeping, receiving visitors in a chamber heavy with incense and the smell of fresh lilies. Rome saw a young widow, bereft and dignified, but behind closed doors, the rumours sharpened their edges. Had she known of the plot? Had she turned her face away when Cesare entered that night? Or the darkest theory of all, had she herself given the nod, deciding that her husband's death was the price of survival in her family's dangerous world? The truth was buried alongside Alfonso, in a quiet ceremony attended by few. The Vatican moved on quickly. Alliances had to be reshaped, enemies dealt with, and the machinery of power could not pause for grief. Cesare continued his military campaigns. Pope Alexander tightened his control over the Papal States. And Lucrezia, she was left to navigate the treacherous waters of a court that had swallowed her second husband whole. Yet something in her shifted after Alfonso's death. She was no longer the bright, pliable daughter willing to be moved like a piece on her father's board. There was a new steel in her gaze, a quiet calculation in the way she listened, in the way she spoke. If her family had taught her one thing, it was that in Rome, you were either the player or the game, and the game was far from over. Because within a year, another banquet would be held, another death would shake the city, and this time, Lucrezia's name would not just be whispered in suspicion, it would be spoken openly, with fear. The summer of 1501 Rome was thick with heat and the scent of tension. War in the north had shifted the balance of power yet again, and Pope Alexander VI was determined to tighten his grip on the city and its alliances. The Borgias understood that politics was not confined to council chambers or battlefields. It was also waged at tables heavy with food, under chandeliers dripping with wax, where enemies could be silenced without ever drawing a blade. That night, the palazzo of Cardinal Orsini glittered with excess. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration, an evening of reconciliation between the Pope's faction and several noble families whose loyalty had wavered. The guest list was carefully curated. Dukes, ambassadors, bishops, and merchants, each with influence enough to either strengthen or weaken the Borgia hold on Rome. And at the centre of it all, as always, was Lucrezia. She entered the hall with the poise of a queen, her gown a cascade of black velvet embroidered with gold thread, her hair bound in jewelled nets that caught the light with every movement. There was no mourning veil now. Alfonso's death was over a year past, and yet her beauty carried a gravity, an almost dangerous serenity. When she smiled, men leaned closer. When she laughed, conversations paused to listen. The banquet began as they always did, with elaborate platters of roast game, sugared fruits, and wines poured into goblets, so fine they rang like bells when set down. The air was warm with the mingling scents of meat, honey, and incense, and the low hum of political theatre played out in every whispered exchange between guests. But beneath the civility ran an undercurrent of rivalry. At the far end of the table sat representatives of the Colonna and Orsini families' ancient houses that had clashed with the Borgias for decades. They smiled and toasted, but their eyes were cold. In such company, every gesture mattered. Every drop of wine could be a gesture of friendship or of warning. It was during the second course, as the servants moved between tables, that the moment came. A decanter of deep red wine was brought to a certain guest. a prominent noble known for his opposition to Cesare Borgia's military campaigns. The servant hesitated, glancing toward Lucrezia, who was engaged in light conversation with a Venetian envoy. She reached for her own goblet, her hand passing briefly over the decanter. To some, it was nothing, a fleeting, meaningless gesture. To others, it was the signal. The noble lifted his goblet and raised it toward her in a mocking toast. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, and inclined her head. He drank. Within minutes, the hall's polished composure cracked. The man's face drained of color, his hands trembling as the goblet slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Servants froze in place. The man gasped, clutching at his chest, and then crumpled to the ground. Shouts erupted. Physicians were called for, but the man was beyond help almost immediately. The word spread faster than the panic. Poison. And with that single word, all eyes turned to Lucrezia. The servant nearest to him stammered that he had seen her touch the goblet moments before it was served. Her supporters scoffed at the claim, insisting it was the heat, the wine, perhaps an old illness. But the rumors that had dogged her since her first marriage now rushed back with lethal force. Some whispered the name of a substance that had haunted Italy's nobility for years. Cantarella. Said to be the Borgia's poison of choice, it was rumored to be a slow-acting, colorless powder, capable of killing without leaving a trace. Tales claimed it was kept in rings, in hollowed beads, in tiny vials sewn into sleeves. In the right hands, it was a ghost, invisible, silent, deadly. Whether cantarella truly existed, or was merely the invention of her enemies, hardly mattered. The fear of it was real, and that fear was now bound to Lucrezia's name like a chain. And yet, nothing could be proven. Guards searched her, her seat, her tableware. No vial, no powder. Her gown and sleeves were immaculate. She met every accusation with cool composure, her voice steady, her hands folded in her lap. "I grieve as you do," she said softly, "but I am no executioner." In the hours that followed, the dead man's allies seethed, and the Borgia supporters quietly celebrated the removal of another obstacle. By morning, Rome was buzzing. Had the Pope's daughter struck again? Or was she simply a convenient scapegoat for every unexplained death in the city? Lucrezia left the banquet hall with her head high, her face unreadable, her steps unhurried. She had been accused before and survived. She would survive this too. But survival in Rome always came at a price, and she was beginning to understand just how much she was willing to pay. The next marriage her father arranged for her would remove her from the Vatican's direct orbit. But as she would soon learn, distance did not dissolve the shadows that clung to her. If anything, they would follow her north into the cold, watchful court of Ferrara. In 1502, Lucrezia Borgia left Rome under the watchful gaze of an entire city. Her departure was no quiet affair. The streets filled with murmuring crowds as her entourage wound its way through the gates, heading north toward Ferrara. This was not merely a bride traveling to her new home. This was the Pope's daughter, a woman whose name was whispered with a mix of fear, fascination, and scandal, riding into the territory of a family who had demanded proof of her worth before agreeing to the match. Her groom was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The Este family was cultured, proud, and fiercely protective of their autonomy. They had little love for the Borgias, whose reputation for corruption and violence preceded them. When the match was proposed, Alfonso's family hesitated, wary of the rumors that surrounded Lucrezia like a perfume. Was she the poisoner, her enemies claimed, a seductress who destroyed every man she touched? Or was she a victim of her father's and brother's schemes? In the end, politics prevailed. The Este family needed the Pope's favor, and the Pope needed his daughter securely tied to a powerful northern house. And so, the marriage was sealed. When Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara, she was met with icy formality. The city itself was a jewel of the Renaissance white marble palaces, winding canals, and gardens bursting with roses. But within the ducal court, eyes followed her every move, measuring her gestures, her words, her silences. Here, She was far from the gilded safety of the Vatican. In Ferrara, she would have to earn her place, and she did. Gone was the image of the idle papal daughter. Lucrezia threw herself into the role of duchess with precision. She learned the rhythms of the court, the politics of the city, and the subtle rivalries within the Este family. She commissioned artists, musicians, and poets, turning Ferrara into a beacon of culture. Visitors wrote admiringly of her elegance, her intelligence, and her ability to host gatherings where even bitter rivals left with softened tempers. For a time, it seemed as though Lucrezia had found a kind of peace. She bore children, managed estates, and gained the respect, even affection of many who had once doubted her. Ferrara's people began to speak of her not as the infamous daughter of the Pope, but as a gracious duchess who cared for her subjects. But shadows do not fade so easily. Even in Ferrara, the old whispers followed her. When a courtier died suddenly after a banquet, rumours sprang to life before the body was cold. When a visiting ambassador fell ill, tongues wagged about cantarella again. There was never proof, only the lingering scent of suspicion. And politics in Italy were never still. The Pope's fortunes rose and fell. Cesare's military ambitions brought him both glory and ruin. Every time the Borgias made a move, Ferrara felt the ripples. Letters arrived from Rome, some affectionate, others carrying the weight of political demands. Lucrezia navigated them with care, never openly defying her family, but never allowing Ferrara to become a mere pawn in the Vatican's game. Still, her past was never far from her. Courtiers in Ferrara learned quickly that while the Duchess could be warm and gracious, there was an invisible line one did not cross. Those who tested it with an insult, a slight, a careless rumour, often found their fortunes suddenly reversed. A land grant revoked, a patron withdrawn, an invitation quietly rescinded. Whether or not Lucrezia's hand was behind it, the message was clear. She was not to be underestimated. By the end of her first decade in Ferrara, Lucrezia had transformed her public image from that of a papal pawn into a sovereign force in her own right. Yet the cost of this transformation was high. She had learned to hide her feelings, to cloak her ambitions in diplomacy, and to accept that power always came with enemies. And though she was far from Rome, the web of her family's intrigues still clung to her. In private, she kept up correspondence with Cesare, whose fortunes were beginning to unravel. His enemies grew bolder, his victories fewer. And in those letters, if the whispers were true, Lucrezia offered not just comfort, but aid. It was a dangerous loyalty, one that could pull her back into the very scandals she had worked so hard to escape. And as the years passed, fate would give her no shortage of opportunities to test just how far she was willing to go for her family and for her own survival. By the second decade of the 1502nd, Lucrezia Borgia had mastered the art of survival. As Duchess of Ferrara, she walked a careful line between diplomacy and dominance, keeping her court polished and her enemies wary. Yet no matter how far she rose, the old shadows clung to her name like a second skin. Tragedy seemed determined to follow her. Several of her children died young, each loss striking like a dagger. In 1512, her beloved son Rodrigo, the child she had with Alfonso of Aragon before his murder, died at the age of 12. Those who knew her said she locked herself away for days, refusing to eat or speak. The court whispered that for all her poise, she carried her grief in silence, like a stone beneath her gown. While Ferrara saw her as a capable ruler and patron, the outside world never stopped scrutinizing her. This was especially true when rumors began to circulate of secret correspondence between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare. By then, Cesare's fortune had collapsed. The once feared commander was a prisoner, stripped of much of his power, yet somehow he still reached out to her, and, according to her enemies, she reached back. The letters were never found in full, but the fragments and testimonies from rival courts painted a damning picture. They spoke of coded phrases, of instructions for moving gold, of promises to leverage Ferrara's influence on his behalf. Whether these claims were exaggerated or entirely fabricated hardly mattered. In the poisoned atmosphere of Italian politics, perception was often as dangerous as fact. If true, her actions would have placed her in direct defiance of her husband's political interests. Ferrara had no desire to entangle itself in Cesare's doomed campaigns, and Alfonso d'Este would have seen such loyalty as a betrayal. If false, the rumours still served their purpose to remind the world that Lucrezia Borgia could never truly escape the web her family had spun. Compounding the gossip were renewed whispers about her personal life. Some suggested she had taken lovers, citing the closeness she shared with poets and courtiers. Others claimed she used these relationships to gather information, weaving her own quiet network of influence in Ferrara. Whether it was slander or strategy, the result was the same. Her name once again hummed with scandal. By 1518, Lucrezia's health had begun to falter. Years of pregnancies and the relentless strain of political life had taken their toll. In June of 1519, after giving birth to her last child, a daughter who did not survive, she was struck by a severe infection. For days, she drifted between fevered dreams and lucidity. Some said she prayed for her children. Others claimed she muttered names from the past, Cesare, Rodrigo, Alfonso, as though summoning ghosts. Her death on the 24th of June, at the age of 39, sent ripples through Italy. In Ferrara, she was mourned sincerely. The people saw her as a generous duchess who had brought art, music, and stability to their city. In Rome, reactions were colder, tinged with the satisfaction of seeing the last great figure of the Borgia court laid to rest. But the scandals did not die with her. In the weeks after her passing, stories resurfaced about the cantarella, about her alleged role in her husband's fates, about the supposed love she bore her brother. Poets immortalized her as both angel and serpent, saint and sinner. Historians argued over her motives, her loyalties, and her culpability. The truth was buried with her in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, where her tomb bore no elaborate inscription, only her name, as if daring future generations to decide for themselves what it meant. For some, she was the perfect example of Renaissance corruption, a woman who wielded beauty and power like twin daggers, unafraid to use either. For others, she was a victim of her family's ruthless ambitions, a woman whose life was written in the margins of men's wars. But for all the words spent on her, one fact remained unchanged. The name Lucrezia Borgia would never be spoken without a shadow following close behind. And that shadow was about to grow darker still in the telling of her legacy. In the centuries since her death, Lucrezia Borgia's story has been told and retold in hushed rumours, in venomous pamphlets, in paintings that depict her as either a Madonna or a temptress. Historians have tried to untangle truth from slander, sifting through letters, court records, and eyewitness accounts. Yet the more they dig, the more the lines blur. Some evidence suggests she was nothing more than a pawn in her father's and brother's relentless pursuit of power, married off like a chess piece to cement alliances, abandoned when those alliances failed. Other accounts hint at a sharper mind, a woman who learned to navigate and even manipulate the dangerous currents of Renaissance politics for her own survival. The infamous cantarella remains one of the most persistent legends. Whether it truly existed, or whether it was simply the convenient invention of her enemies, it became inseparable from her name. In an age when political murder was as common as betrayal, poison was the perfect crime. Invisible, untraceable, and impossible to defend against. And who better, the world asked, to wield it than the Pope's golden-haired daughter? But the portraits from her years in Ferrara tell another story, one of a cultured, intelligent woman who transformed a cold, suspicious court into a thriving centre of art and music. She patronized poets, welcomed scholars, and earned the love of her subjects. It is this version of Lucrezia that her adopted city remembered, not the poisoner of Rome, but the duchess who left Ferrara stronger than she found it. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the saint and the sinner. Perhaps Lucrezia Borgia was both, a survivor who learned to wear the mask her enemies had painted for her, turning their fear into a shield. In the end, her greatest power may not have been poison or beauty, but the way she made herself unforgettable. Her tomb in Ferrara bears no grand epitaph, no poetic farewell, just her name. A name that, over 500 years later, still sparks curiosity, debate, and unease. Because Lucrezia Borgia's real legacy is this: she refuses to be neatly defined. And that is why we are still talking about her. If you've stayed with me through this dark journey into the heart of the Renaissance, you now know why her story has survived for centuries. But here's the thing, the past is filled with figures like Lucrezia, whose lives were half truth and half myth, crafted by enemies and remembered by history's sharpest pens. So, what do you think? Was Lucrezia a victim of her family's sins, or the quiet architect of her own legend? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's most infamous women, hit that like button, subscribe for more tales of power and betrayal, and share this video with someone who loves a good scandal. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the past is never as far behind us as we like to think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next dark chapter of history.